are back with the return to Switch emulation with Skyline, and the emulator has made tremendous progress since the last time I looked at the trifecta of T618 devices, including the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, Anbernic RG505, and Powkiddy X18S. For that video, I provided a few games that ran well on those devices running on Skyline Edge version 19. It's been a few months since then, and now I will be checking out a whole different group of games that run pretty well on Skyline Edge versions 43 and 44. As you can tell, we have quite a lot of progress since then, so without further delay, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and let's check out an additional 10 Switch games that are worth trying out on these handhelds. I really wanted to keep things simple for the viewer, so I have tested all the games using one set of settings. I highly recommend checking out my first video on Skyline for these handhelds, where I talk a little more about the emulator and setup. Since Skyline is still so early in development, there isn't a whole lot to tweak. Anyways, for this video, my Skyline settings are as follows. All games were tested on Skyline Edge version 43 and 44. They are all set to handheld mode. I have forced triple buffering turned on. I have set the Executor slot count scale to 4. And the Executor flush threshold to the maximum of 1024. Everything else remains unchecked. With these settings, the games that follow should run as they do in this video. These are not going to be hard-hitting games, and expectations should be kept to a minimum. As I always say, the ability for something like these T618 powered handhelds to run a few Switch games is just a fun little bonus and adds to the available library of games to play. First up, and by far the most exciting game that works very well now with Skyline Edge, is Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. I know there will be quite a few of my viewers that will be excited to see that this is now performing well, running at mostly 60 frames per second, and definitely very playable. I didn't experience any crashing in my own personal testing, but given that Skyline Edge is still very much in active development, expect that these issues can crop up for any of the games mentioned here. Next up is a very slick indie game with a killer soundtrack, and this one isn't quite 60 frames per second, but I found it to be pretty playable, and it is quite stable. It's definitely one worth checking out if you have one of the T618 devices. I did try its spiritual sequel, Valfaris, but that one wouldn't run on these handhelds, unfortunately. This next one is an inclusion that I am personally pretty excited about, and I love both Mini Metro and the game being shown here, which is Mini Motorways. There's something just absolutely relaxing about these games, and I usually enjoy playing them before bedtime. It's so beautifully simple in concept with a great visual style that accompanies it. Mini Motorways is quite playable with Skyline, and it mostly maintains 60 frames per second, but will start to dip as the map gets larger. Given the type of game it is, the dip in frame rate isn't the worst thing, so I wanted to include it here on this list as it's worth mentioning, and again, a personal favorite of mine. It's a shame that Mini Motorways is exclusive to Apple Arcade, since this would have definitely seen a native Android port, but now with Skyline, many can enjoy it on their Android devices. For the next set of games, we have a few of the Steamworld games. First up is naturally going to be Steamworld Dig, and this one is as solid as it gets on these handheld devices with Skyline. It's running very well here at 60 frames per second and seems to be quite stable overall. It's definitely a great game worth including on this list, and again, without emulation would not be playable on an Android device. It's worth noting that there is a Vita and 3DS version of this game, but I have not tested it on those platforms' emulators. Next up, of course, is the sequel, Steamworld Dig 2, and this is another one that just runs exceptionally well with this emulator on the T618 handhelds. Steamworld Dig 2 is a very nice improvement over the original, and I think I prefer this one more. Regardless, both Steamworld Dig games are well worth playing if you are into Metroidvania-style games. This one has a Vita and 3DS version that I have not yet tested over on their respective emulators for Android. And finally, the last Steamworld game I will be including on this list, and it's a departure from the other games in terms of gameplay. This is set up as more of a turn-based tactical shooter and still very much a great game despite its different gameplay. The game doesn't quite hold that 60 frames per second target, but given the turn-based nature of the game, it really isn't much of an issue, and the game is very playable and stable. This one also has a 3DS and Vita version that I have not yet tested. Golf Story is another personal favorite of mine. I remember when this game was first announced, and I was so excited because it reminded me of Mario Golf for the Game Boy Color, which was basically a golf RPG, and that is exactly what Golf Story is. This game is a full-blown Nintendo Switch exclusive, and it's a real treat that it is very playable here with Skyline, staying locked at 60 frames per second and very stable throughout. There is a sequel that was recently released called Sports Story, and I have not yet had a chance to try it out, but I heard it's not as good as Golf Story. Next up is a pretty well-known indie title. The Messenger is a very slick action platformer that is inspired by games like the classic Ninja Gaiden. There are some interesting elements with this game, and one of the cool things is that the visual style will change from 8-bit graphics to 16-bit graphics over the course of the story. The Messenger is another great performing game with Skyline with no major issues in terms of stability or performance. Next up is a game I was pretty excited as working on these devices. Wargroove is a turn-based tactics game developed by Chucklefish, and that studio has a good amount of familiarity with fantastic indie games, such as being the publisher of Risk of Rain and Stardew Valley at one point. Now, I feel like Wargroove is not a very well-known game, despite it being a really awesome one that is heavily inspired by Nintendo's own Advance Wars franchise. So for fans of Advance Wars, this is a good one to keep you entertained until Advance Wars finally drops next month on the Nintendo Switch. Performance overall is pretty good, and again, given that this is a turn-based game, dips in frame rate aren't much of an issue to deal with here. Finally, the last game being featured in this video is Rogue Legacy 2. Now, I saved this one for last because during my own personal testing, I found this to be the worst performing of the games I am including on this list. Performance never really stays at 60 frames per second throughout and hovers more around 45 to 50 frames per second. However, I didn't find that to be much of an issue, and I still think the game is quite playable. My bigger concern is that the game did have a random crash to the Skyline home screen. It's not a deal breaker though, since it did occur very rarely for me during testing, but it was something that I did not experience with the other games on this list. Additionally, the game does a decent job saving your progress, so I don't think this is too big of an issue, and it's still worth checking out this awesome game. And with that, we have come to the end of this video. I'm pretty excited about the inclusion of these 10 games to add to a growing list of playable games for the trifecta of T618 devices. I think overall these are some worthy inclusions that many will be excited to play and enjoy. I am sure I will be revisiting Skyline yet again in the future as progress is occurring at such a rapid pace. In the meantime, definitely check out my first video on this topic, which has a few other games worth playing on these handhelds. As always, this is the Retro Tech Dad, and I thank you so much for watching.